Hi everyone, back with another video. So today what we're going to talk about is an overview of grad school. So this applies to a PhD more than a master's, but we'll also talk about a master's a little bit. So the three components that I would really break grad school into are the classes that you're going to have to take, the preliminary or qualifying exams that you'll have to take, and your dissertation. Let's kind of break down each one of these and kind of give an overview about how each one of these work and how it's different than what you may have experienced before. So the first one are classes. So everyone's taking classes in high school, college, but grad school classes are a little different. So the way most departments will do grad school classes is that you will have to take X amount of credits that are general, that everyone in the department takes. So if you're in a molecular biology department, these may be things like genetics, biochemistry, and you need to also take some credits that are more specialized. So it's similar to college, where if you're a biology major or a chemistry major, you may take sort of general science classes and then more specialized as you move up. And so this works the same way. As you move up, you may need to take more physiology or molecular oncology, for example. And the way these classes work is that you generally need to have a certain GPA overall. So in my department, when I was a graduate student, you needed to have a 3.0 GPA overall. Some departments are stricter and have a 3.5, but there's usually a grade point requirement. And it's important to meet this requirement. But what you're going to find is that there are some differences between grad school classes and undergrad classes. So if you go to a larger university, you're probably used to undergrad classes that have 100 or more students in them, sometimes smaller. But in grad school, you're going to be in classes that are much, much smaller. You may only have 10 kids in a class. And this is important because unlike undergrad, where you may have been able to not attend classes, in grad school, you really need to attend every single class. The other big difference is that, at least in my experience, I felt that the classes in undergrad were actually harder than they were in grad school. In undergrad, you're more responsible for knowing more of the fine details. And in grad school, it's more about big picture. How does everything fit together? And the other difference is that because a PhD is a research-based program, a lot of your exams are also going to focus on experimental design as well. So for example, if you took cell biology in college, you probably remember there's a whole section on protein trafficking. So protein trafficking to the mitochondria, etc. And in undergrad, they may have asked questions specifically about how does that trafficking work. And in grad school, they'll probably ask similar questions, but they're also going to ask experimental questions. If you believe that protein X is trafficked from point A to point B, how do you test that experimentally? And these are things to keep in mind as you prepare for your classes, that these are some of the questions that you may be asked. Another important thing to note is that unlike undergrad, where classes is your only thing that you have to do, in grad school, people tend to be a little bit more, I wouldn't say lenient on classes, but it's not the focus. Nobody, when you're applying for a postdoc, is going to ask, what was your GPA in grad school? It just isn't going to happen. So your GPA in grad school is going to be important for making sure that you can pass to move to the next step, and also for some other things. For example, if you apply for an F32, which is a fellowship that you could get as an early postdoc through NIH, they may ask for what your grad school grades were. But other than that, your grades are not as important. So my personal advice is that you should work hard in your grad school classes. I don't think anyone should blow off their classes, and I think that they do serve a purpose, and it is important to do well in them. But what you're going to find is that most PIs are going to really focus on the research aspect. So that the classes kind of takes care of the first part. Now, once you've completed your classes, and your advisor will tell you that you need to complete X amount of credits and that these things need to be met. Once you've met all these requirements, you're then ready to take what are called your preliminary or qualifying exams. And this is something that varies greatly between departments. So I'm going to kind of try to cover the spectrum of how qualifying exams work. So qualifying or preliminary exams are a way to test your ability to think and to weed out people that should not really be in grad school. Now, typically each grad department has a different failure rate. Sometimes it's one kid a year maybe doesn't pass. Sometimes it's 50% of people don't pass. It kind of depends on where you are. But your qualifying exams or preliminary exams, or sometimes they're called quals or prelims, I'll typically refer to them as prelims because that's what they were called in my department. They kind of fall into two categories, a written category and a oral category. So let's talk about the written category first. So for the written, this is done differently. So sometimes in some departments what it will be is it will be all of the faculty in that department will write questions that are kind of the same to everybody. And all of the questions will be answered over a course of a few days. So instead of doing research or classes, you take 3 days, say, and you sit in a room and you take these tests. And the professors will grade them and they will give a score back to your main PI. That's one way. The way that it was done in my department was that every PI on your committee, and we'll talk about forming a committee in another video, but just real briefly, your committee is sort of the gatekeeper, that they decide how you pass your prelims and they decide how you pass your dissertation. They're very important. I'm going to dedicate a whole video to them. So the way it typically worked in my department was you would have 5 committee members, including your PI, and each one would write a few questions for your prelim, and they were geared towards the research that you were working on. And so each day you would go meet with that one member on your committee. They'd give you your questions. You'd spend a whole day working on their questions, and so it was a 5-day exam. And the way it typically works is there's a minimum threshold. So in my department and in other departments around me, it was you needed to score 80% to pass. If you didn't get an 80%, you had to retake that part. And if you didn't pass a second time, then you were out. And now this is where there's big variation between departments. So some departments, you need an 80% to pass, and if you don't pass, you have to take the whole thing over again, whereas my department, it was just that one part. Also, what varies is the amount of, I guess, help or suggestion you get from faculty. So I passed mine on the first time, so this didn't apply to me, but I know many people who didn't. And for the people that didn't, a lot of times the professors in my department were very helpful. They would say, well, you didn't pass because of X, Y, and Z, and this is kind of what you need to improve on to pass the next time. Some departments don't really give you that guidance. They kind of just mark down your score and you're left to your own devices to figure it out. But once you do pass your prelims, you have one last part, which is an oral component. And a lot of people will refer to this as your proposal. Now, what is a proposal? Think of this as the, if you think about your dissertation as a final paper that you publish, your proposal is sort of the grant that you're writing to do the project. So this is where you sit down with your committee and you introduce to them the topic that you're going to be researching, why it's important, what preliminary data you've already generated, and kind of what are your aims. So aim 1A, 1B, 2A, 2B, 2C, etc. And you outline what it is that you want to do. And you give a presentation that's, about an hour in length. And afterwards, the professors on your committee are going to ask questions. And a lot of the questions, although they can be about general science, a lot of the questions are going to be geared towards the research. So what will you do if experiment X and aim 1A doesn't work? How will you go about that? What are alternative strategies? So these are things that you should be keeping in mind as you prepare. And we'll make an entire video dedicated to your prelims and to your oral proposal, because these are very important parts of your graduate school experience, and an area that, frankly, a lot of students really struggle with, more than the dissertation itself. So this is an area we're going to focus heavily on. And then after that, You are no longer just a graduate student. Now you're a PhD candidate. You've been admitted to candidacy once you pass this part. So what does that mean? That means that you are sometimes referred to as ABD, all but dissertation. It means all that you have left in your requirements is to fill out a sheet that says I've done my dissertation hours, and you need to write your dissertation and defend it. And so the dissertation, what is a dissertation? And again, we'll have an entire video dedicated to what is a dissertation, because this is a really important thing. So your dissertation is the accumulation of all the research that you've done throughout graduate school, and you put it together, and it gets bound up into a nice book. And dissertations for PhDs typically range from 100 to 250 pages. So I've seen them anywhere in there. I think mine was 160 or 170 pages. And the dissertation is going to encompass a general introduction that's typically 20 to 40 pages of kind of the scope of the field and where you envision your work fitting into that field. And a lot of times it gets written in a very grandiose way, but it's sort of highlighting where your work fits in. And then you'll have your research that all gets smashed in there with your methods, results, and then you're going to have an overall discussion. How does your research fit into the grander scheme of things? And once you've written that, you'll submit it to your committee, and you'll have your defense date. And your defense date, you'll give a presentation about the research that you've done, and by this point your committee has seen your, or should have seen your presentation. Not the specific one you'll give on your defense, but over time they should have seen multiple times kind of what it is that you've been working on, so they already have a good idea. And they're going to afterwards ask questions, and the questions can be general science related. So I've seen people that have reached back and asked questions about what you studied in biochem the first year, but for the most part the questions are going to be more focused about what is it that happened in your research, what did you learn, what areas could you improve on, if you were to go back and do it again, what would you do differently. And so this is kind of what the focus is. How it differs from a master's student, really the biggest difference is the preliminary exams. So you don't have to take preliminary exams as a master's student. You typically don't have to take as many of the advanced courses. You usually just take more of the general courses that everybody takes, and the amount of research you need in your dissertation is much less. So I would say typically a master's student will take about 3 years to finish, and a PhD student will take about 5 to 6 years. And this varies. So my PhD lasted just around 3 years, so I was very fast, but not everybody will go that fast, and that's fine. You could take 3 years, you could take 6 years. One isn't more, how fast you finish your PhD is not indicative of how successful you're going to be, and that's an important thing to keep in mind. So what else encompasses a PhD? Because that seems pretty straightforward, right? You take your classes, you do your prelims, and you do some research and write your dissertation. So what else encompasses a PhD? Okay, so what else is involved is learning experimental techniques. So some of you will have done research in your undergrad, but in a PhD you have to have a whole new level of understanding of how experiments work, and you're going to have to learn many new experiments. This is going to be the majority of your time, is learning experiments and executing those experiments. Other things that I strongly suggest, if your department does not require it, which most likely they will, you really need to publish your work. Publishing your work is key. The easiest way to get your committee to agree to let you defend is to say, I've already published my work. It's been published, it's been through the peer review process, and we're going to have a whole video dedicated to publishing your work. But the other thing is that it is paramount to finding a postdoc position. If you don't have a publication, you will not find a postdoc position. And if you don't have multiple publications, it will be hard to find a good postdoc position. So it's very, very important to publish. This is maybe the most important thing you will do in graduate school, is to publish first author work. other things that you can do that will help you in terms of facilitating your graduation and in finding a good postdoc position are applying for grants. Your PI will help you, and I will make a whole video about applying for grants. Helping your PI with peer review, or helping your PI write a review article. If your PI is going to be writing a review article, ask, hey, can I help co-author this? Or you're reviewing a paper, or the next time you review a paper, can I help? These are things that you could put on your CV, and we will have a video dedicated to building your CV, because this is an important part of not just graduating, but finding that postdoc position, and then having a CV built up enough that when you finish your postdoc, it looks sufficient to finding a faculty position. So all of this really goes into the experience of graduate school. And I know I threw a lot out there, but each of these are going to become their own separate videos. But I just wanted to put out a video explaining sort of an overview of what graduate school will be like. So with that, I want to thank you. Please like the video, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks.